Welcome to the Texas Psychologist. I'm Dr. John Dolatorre, and here's a snippet from today's session.
The pathways that lead to the killing. And that's what we really focus on when we're doing this kind of work, not necessarily under, not like judging the person or saying, oh my gosh, how can this happen? But we're trying to seek understanding of where the warning signs were and the pathways that led to the person killing their child.
Welcome to the Texas Psychologist podcast. I'm Dr. John Dolatorre. Today with me, I have a special guest, Dr. Nicole Vienna. She is a licensed psychologist out in California. Dr. Vienna, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I am a forensic psychologist here in California. I've had my private practice for about 10 years. And prior to private practice, I worked for the government, like most of us do, to get my hours and some experience. Currently in practice, I do criminal cases only, both with juveniles and adults.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about something I think is probably one of the more difficult topics to not only kind of participate in as a forensic psychologist, um, but to really kind of talk about as parents, to talk about as society, to talk about kind of why would someone do this particular crime. And the crime we're going to be talking about today is filicide. Some people expect to have a trigger warning for this. I think, I'll probably have a trigger warning episode about what those actually are and what they actually do. But for those of you who are especially sensitive to a topic like this, make sure that you check, yourself, and make sure that you monitor everything that you need to monitor in order to keep yourself safe during this conversation. But Dr. Vienna, if you could please explain a little bit of what is filicide.
So, filicide is the killing of a child by the parent. Parent in the literature is defined as anywhere from the biological mother, father, or caregiver. So, it's a tragic, unfortunate circumstance, but what we also see in the literature is the pathways that lead to the killing. And that's what we really focus on when we're doing this kind of work, not necessarily under not like judging the person or saying, oh my gosh, how can this happen? But we're trying to seek understanding of where the warning signs were and the pathways that led to the person killing their child. And it's not always based in mental illness, there are other pathways.
Can you think of a couple of cases, a couple of cases in the media or in the true crime sphere that some people, some audience members might be able to kind of look on and kind of research a little bit more?
Sure. I think there's a couple pretty famous cases out there, or infamous cases, if you will. Most common people, when they hear filicide, will think about either the Andrea Yates case or Susan Smith. So, both of those, there's a lot of open source material on them. They happened quite a few years ago, but nonetheless, I think it brought the attention to the general public that such a problem does exist. So, Andrea Yates was the case out of Texas where we saw some profound mental illness happen. And then Andrea Yates ended up drowning her five children. And I believe she had two trials. So I believe the first trial, they actually found her guilty. And that's in your home state, right? Texas.
Yeah, it's in Texas. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just putting that together. So the first trial, they found a jury found her guilty, and then she had a second trial on an appeal, and then that's when they found her not guilty by reason of insanity. So there were experts in both trials, both forensic psychologists, forensic psychiatrists. Actually, I believe they are both forensic psychiatrists. I think it was Phil Resnick and Park Dietz, he's out of Newport Beach here in California, and but that I think Andrea Yates' case really does show us that what we would commonly see in the public, or what the public thinks is like the mental illness that drives the behavior of killing the children. And then Susan Smith, a little bit different. She was that was the case out of South Carolina. I want to say that case probably happened in the 90s sometime. I was very small. I remember I was in like grade school when that happened. It was such a shock. But the interesting thing about the Susan Smith case was she made up a story that I think a black man took her children during a carjacking. And then she went on with this sort of story, this ruse, if you will, for days, and led the police on this, like, chase. And then it comes out at the end of the day, it was actually her that killed her children. So, that was more of like a case of deception, not necessarily a mental illness, although her defense team did put up a mental health defense that she had, depression and maybe some, disconnection from reality. But it didn't go as far. It didn't show, any genuine psychosis like the Andrea Yates case did. So those are like the two common, I would say, for on the female side. But we tend to forget about the males that do also commit suicide. I'm sorry. We forget about the males that engage in filicide because it's out there too, just not readily talked about, and that could be for a variety of reasons. But we do have the Chris Watts case, and I believe, I'm not sure what state he was in. Nebraska? No, Colorado. He was out of Colorado. And so this is the case that we see where it's intertwined with some domestic violence and jealousy. It wasn't a psychosis that drove the killing, but more so public source records show that he was having an affair with a coworker, and he ended up killing his wife and children, and the wife was pregnant. So I mean, he was charged with multiple murders of his two daughters that were, I think they were aged like 9 and 10, somewhere around there, and then the unborn child and his wife. So sometimes filicide can bleed into family annihilation. So I think
Yeah,
those are three good cases that people would want to check out a little bit more about.
yeah, I was going to ask about that. So when we think of the sort of sex characteristics when it comes to engaging in this behavior, do you see do you see it where women tend to only kill their children and men tend to be family annihilators? Like, why is it that maybe women don't also kill the spouse and the family pet? Like, what do you think is kind of at play here when it comes to kind of the sex differences between people who would carry out this kind of crime?
Well, I think first we have to put out there that sometimes the cases that are covered in the media, or how the media covers cases, can be very genderized. And we have to, really take a look at how the media and the public looks at women who kill their kids and then men that kill their kids. It might just be that the cases on the men aren't covered as much as the women, because one hypothesis could be, and this is just my overview of what we see in the media and then looking back at some of the research, we have more research on women that kill their kids than we do men. That's just what we see in the research. Um, but I do think it's that the media and the public tend to see women in sort of these maternal roles. And so it creates this bigger shock when women kill their kids, because it's contrary to what we want, the public may want to believe in their mind about how a woman or a mother should be. So that is like one of my hypotheses. And just the fact that I don't think men are covered as much in the media when this happens. Or what we do see is, if the men are covered, like the case I just talked about, the Chris Watts case, it is tied more to violence and family issues, like, affairs and that kind of stuff. And we rarely see the mental illness part come out. And I say that because I'm based in Los Angeles, so there are cases. I have not worked on the forensic side of things, but back when I worked in the jails for, the county government system, and I was doing clinical work, these individuals would be housed in our inpatient hospitals within the jail, and there were some men that did kill their family, and there were some mental illness issues at play in those cases, just like what we see, in the Andrea Yates case, or some of the other LA cases I've seen recently about filicide. So it largely could be a media issue and could be just the way our values are structured, our own values within like a family system.
So let's talk a little bit. You had said a word earlier that, for someone like me who does threat assessment, uh, has a specific definition. You said pathway, and
Mhm.
so I'm not really asking you about the specific cases that you've worked on, but I want to know more about the process of how do you get assigned to one of these cases, and what exactly is it that you're doing as a psychologist when you're conducting these kinds of evaluations.
Such a great question. As forensic psychologists, we are usually appointed to a case or we take a case, right, when there's a psycholegal question involved. So it's not that an attorney will come to me or the court will come to me and say, Dr. Vienna, will you take on this filicide case? The police might talk about that, but as a psychologist, we're looking at the psycholegal question. And typically in these cases, and in my experience particularly, uh, I'm usually asked about a criminal responsibility question. And so, in criminal responsibility here in California, most common is the not guilty by reason of insanity question, right? And so, it's looking at, for our statute here, we use a McNaughton statute or a McNaughton based process to evaluate not guilty by reason of insanity. And so we're looking at wrongfulness at the time of the offense, both legally and morally. So a little bit of an offshoot of McNaughton. And I'm taking a look at a case, whether it was filicide or not, but in the filicide cases, commonly it is looking at their responsibility of wrongfulness at the time of the crime. So did they know what they did was right or wrong, simply put, at the time of the offense? Or did they not know? Typically what I've seen in my cases and some of like the Andrea Yates case is morally they didn't know it was wrong at the time of the crime. And so I'm going through the evaluation, taking that forensic approach.
Um, so generally speaking, when you're conducting a criminal responsibility, you're kind of just talking to the individual and you're asking, what did you think that you were doing? From your perspective, are there is there more than just this interview? Are there psychological tests that you're going to be administering? What is kind of the nuts and bolts of ultimately what your report to the court is going to look like?
Yeah, so it's going to be like a typical forensic evaluation. We're going to do all of the same things in terms of using like a multi-method assessment. We're going to be looking at records. And in filicide cases, I think particularly because they fall under criminal responsibility, most of them, not all of them. Sometimes, like in the Susan Smith case, they did get a mitigation expert. So that's, just looking at mitigating factors. But in the criminal responsibility, especially filicide, because of the pathways that got the person there to that action of killing their kid, records are extremely important. So I'm asking for all kinds of records. I'm looking at psychiatric records. I want to look at if there's cognitive issues, and of course, we're going to ask for any sort of academic records or what we call the regional center records where someone's treated for developmental delay. But what we're looking for really within these records and any other records, I don't want to cut that records part short. I get family records like from children and family services. I get family court records, maybe if there was a custody case, any kind of records that would highlight or show um, mental health treatment, mental health diagnoses, medications, and most importantly, I think, is the stressors that the person dealt with along the way and what happened there. Did they get medications? Did they work? Did they not work? What stressors were present that they couldn't handle? And then what happened afterwards? Were there subsequent psychiatric symptoms? Were there prior episodes of psychosis, mood issues, depression? So we are looking for like that pathway in these records. And it's not because I'm putting a research paper together in my forensic report and I'm describing the pathway, the mental illness pathway, the severe psychosis that led to this, but they are factors that lead up to how did the person get to the place they were at the time of the offense? What was their mental state? What was going on right before, the day before, the week before, the month before, that led into at the moment. So we are looking a lot at records. In terms of testing, there is no test, as you know, that will determine whether someone, knew right from wrong at the time of the offense. Tests don't make the opinion; they sort of support the clinical analysis around the opinion. So we could give, some people give personality tests like the MMPI, PAI. I think in a typical criminal responsibility evaluation, I don't do a lot of testing, actually. I might, if I suspect some feigning or someone that's not credible, I'm going to give some of those, sort of malingering screener tests like the MFAST or something like that. And if, that elevates, then I might go a little bit further and then I'm going to bring in like a SIRS. I might give an MMPI. But I would say typically in mine, I do get some really genuine cases and I don't do a lot of testing. You can do some cognitive testing. We do want to touch on whether the person, knows legal wrongfulness, right? And so we're kind of like touching on an intellectual aspect or some sort of cognitive capacity aspect. I find most people, if you can find that they, went to school up to a certain grade, they graduated, or you're looking at their adaptive behaviors throughout the years, you might have enough to say there's not a cognitive issue at play. But I did actually have a case where there were some pretty significant cognitive issues. A person did have a documented developmental disability. And so I did do some updated testing, cognitive testing in that case. Very rare though. Um, and I think there's some other tests, like some forensic assessment instruments, like I think the Rogers criminal, was it the criminal responsibility scales, something along those lines. I personally don't use those here. Um, I am just looking at, again, records and doing a very thorough clinical interview, then doing the forensic portion, like the sanity inquiry. And that has its own set of questions about mental state at the time of the offense. So testing records, interviews. We're also doing collateral interviews. We can't forget that. That hopefully will give some more insight, and it's just another data point to speak to. Again, this history of the person, their functioning prior to the offense, functioning at the offense, if there were any witnesses or people that knew about the situation. And then, of course, after the offense is important too. That can go into a whole nother conversation, but we're definitely checking records, interviews for functioning after the offense as well. And then that all goes into a report, and an analysis to the court. And again, it's coming back to that referral question of on whether that person understood right from wrong at the time of the offense.
So there are different. I've seen a bunch of different kinds of explanations as to why the person did what they did. Right? They thought that the children had a demon in them, or they thought that the world was coming to an end, and that everybody would be better off if they were, in heaven together or something like that. From your perspective, what role does intelligence play? I mean, like, if someone is more intelligent, does that make them less susceptible, or is it vice versa? So, what role does a person's intellect actually play when it comes to making this ultimate decision to take the lives of their children?
That's a really good question. And I think it's commonly asked about in these cases, especially if you're going to court on a case, and you should address it in your report. So just because someone, let's say, for example, has intact intelligence or has some intact cognitive ability, if you will, they're able to, do daily tasks on their own. They can take care of themselves. They're pretty resourceful. They don't have to even have, super high intelligence, but if they have some intact capacity to make decisions and stuff like that, I would then say that we're looking at, again, at the time of the offense, were they able to rely on that intellect, or did something like the psychosis, hallucinations, delusions overtake that, where they couldn't even rely on their own intellect? They were driven more so by the hallucination and delusion. So they were impaired at the time of the offense, even though they knew right from wrong. But at the time of the offense, were they able to use those cognitive abilities, or what was their reasoning, sort of speak, like their cognitive skill of reasoning impaired because they were unmedicated and they were so committed to the delusion that the intellect capacity was just not, they weren't able to reach for that ability at the time.
So it's not necessarily just how smart someone is. It's also, can do they have the coping resources to utilize what I think, colloquially would be called your rational side, as opposed to like your emotional side. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I called it reasoning skills, so I was pinning it on a cognitive ability. But yes, I mean, the person at the time of the offense was not able to be rational because they weren't able to use those cognitive skills that they do have. Their reasoning was impaired, the decision making was impaired, and it's typically because of the untreated or unmedicated psychiatric symptom, and a severe symptom, not just, my depression wasn't treated, but typically it has to go a little bit beyond that, into the psychosis realm, because that's really when the person's mindset will sort of get off track, and go into, disconnection from reality.
What I think some audience members may be, I think sometimes maybe we misunderstand what exactly a delusion or a hallucination is. What, from your experience, what have been the kind of the most common things that a person was experiencing in terms of delusions and or hallucinations that contributed to them engaging in this behavior?
I would say in the cases that I've worked, and I haven't worked a ton, it's not entirely, common per se, but the in my cases I've seen it has been a bipolar disorder with psychotic features, in a manic episode, and the person's had significant uh, hallucinations. I also see a lot of delusions, and sometimes both delusions and hallucinations. Um, Persecutory delusions where someone might be after the suspect themselves and their children. Um, it could be the government. It could be, just sort of this other, these other sort of, organizations, if you will, that are coming after the person, and they have this delusion that they have to save themselves and their child, and then they engage in the act of killing. Or they have these significant auditory hallucinations where they're hearing, voices telling them to do something for some reason. They do something like, as in, kill themselves or the children. I'm referencing some of the cases in the media, and then cases I've worked. It has sort of been a twofold, in the cases that I've seen and worked, meaning killed them. They've tried to kill themselves and then killed the child.
So we have one element, right? One kind of cohort of individuals who engage in this behavior because, their delusions or hallucinations are of such a severity or of such a degree that there's a compulsion to engage in this behavior. But have you ever evaluated someone who didn't have these things, that their behaviors were done not out of mental illness or distress, but because they, for lack of a better word, wanted to do it?
I personally have not had that case come across. Maybe outside of a filicide case, I have, but not a filicide case particularly.
When you're done and you've gathered all the material and you finished your report and reports turned in, have you ever had to go testify in court? And if so, what was that experience like?
I actually haven't had to testify in my filicide cases, which I found very fortunate. I sent my report in, and I think if you address hopefully all the points that the court wants addressed. And then also, you're addressing holes in information, maybe, holes in your data, and not all data lines up and comes to this nice perfect conclusion. There's always some sort of offshoot, divergent data set. If you can explain all that, I think you're less likely to end up in court. But in these cases, they are pretty high stakes cases. You may, even if you do all that, you may end up in court. I think in my particular times I've had these cases, the experts on the other side, and there's typically in our state, the way our system works in Los Angeles, there's usually an expert on each side. So the defense gets an expert, the prosecution gets an expert, and then sometimes the court gets their own neutral expert. Even though we are neutral third parties to the court, no matter what side we are on, it's just each side gets to select their own expert, and the court gets one. So there's usually three experts in our cases here. And when I did the filicide cases, all the experts had the same opinion. So when the experts have the same opinion, it's less likely that we're going to go to court, because there's really nothing to highlight, discuss, point out. Everyone's typically saying the same thing, and then prosecution says, okay, we're going to submit on these three reports. I think you find yourself in court when there's experts that disagree, because then there's more investigation that needs to happen by the court.
What are people misunderstanding? Whether you're a prosecutor or defense attorney, or just someone who's going to end up on a jury, or just someone who's watching this on TV. What are some things that people misunderstand when it comes to why someone would do this?
I think a lot of misconception comes from, and there's a couple things, but I think most commonly is, how can someone do this? And just because they have mental illness, does it's not an excuse. That's a big one. And so I think our job as a forensic psychologist, when we're working these cases, is really, to do a good investigation, meaning like get your records, do your collateral interviews, do thorough clinical and forensic interviews, and really investigate, that pathway, that you're constructing a timeline, of the person's mental illness, if they in fact had one, and how that unfolded and manifested. And we're seeking to understand that pathway and where the warning signs were, and sort of what might have been missed by systems like, I think particularly if we look at the media cases, which are similar to the cases I've worked, in terms of like the pathways, we see that a lot of the systems miss big warning signs, like especially after women have a children. What was that follow-up care like? Did they ask for help? If they did, what kind of help did they get? Was it enough? Was it up to the standard of care? Were there stressors? What were the family involvement at that time? Were there child custody cases going on? So we're looking sort of at all those factors, because we're seeking understanding, and we're looking for warning signs, and then we're looking, did the interventions fall short? And I think at the end of the day, for each of those entities you mentioned, the prosecution, the defense, the judge, the jury, which part of the public, we're seeking to show them that understanding, not like, why would someone do this, but like, what were they thinking, what led them to the action at the time of the offense. And all that is to say, perhaps there might be better interventions that need to happen. And we might need to look a little bit carefully at some of these warning signs and get those interventions done earlier, so we can prevent future tragedies.
I think there have been some cases where there was an element of postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis.
Mhm.
Where do you think, we're talking about how to provide an intervention, right? Like, how
Mhm.
do we get someone off the pathway to engaging in this kind of violence? Um, what should people understand about the postpartum depression and psychosis that mothers can experience?
I think some of the biggest research or knowledge that we have, is that right after someone has a child, that first 30 days after having a child, hormones drop significantly in women. And so when you couple that with maybe comorbid issues like prior existing depression or anxiety, it tenfolds the risk of having, subsequent postpartum psychosis or postpartum depression. So those are again some of the warning signs we're looking at, and that's what I think might actually get missed with a lot of providers. You would think that it doesn't, but I don't know if everyone is as well versed, even including our medical community, that sees these women and treats them after birth. It's sort of just what I've seen commonly is it's their check-ins of, hey, how are you doing? And it's very very basic. There's no in-depth interviews. There might be some screeners given, like an anxiety screener or a depression screener, but even when they're loading on those, if it's mild or moderate, it's sort of what I've seen is sort of it's not it's looked at like, oh, that's normal, and then they move on. So then there's not a look at other factors as well, like who's helping you take care of this kid at home, and also if you have multiple kids. So it's looking at the how many kids that you already have and how many back to back to back. We're looking, you should look at all those kind of hormone changes with multiple kids, and then your stress level at home, who's helping take care of it. I think a lot of those things are overlooked, the psychosocial factors. I don't know if that answered your question. I think I got off on a little tangent there.
Right. Well, I think, I think the other element is the parents themselves, right? That if you are the spouse, right, or the partner, whoever you are, to someone who's kind of struggling, and
Hmm.
to the individual that's struggling, is not to normalize wanting to kill your children, right? Not to
Right.
make light of that, but if that thought enters into your head, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do it, though, right?
Right. I mean, like you said, not normalizing the thought, but it does happen. Again, we have a lot of different factors at play that could cause that. We have the change in hormones coupled with if there's prior existing anxiety, depression, or any other mental illness, right? So it could cause sort of like a chemical imbalance, just to put it simply, and just it's a very basic explanation, but that's the time when medication could come to play. Talking to, if you're a spouse of the person that had the child, talking to them about the kind of help that they need, talking to the provider, uh, those kinds of things kind of, you know, it happens. And it's about getting the intervention sooner than later.
And not trying to do it by yourself, right? Not thinking that there's professional help for a reason. So reach out if you need help.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen too is that sometimes it's a lot for the spouse to carry. And so the spouse gets overwhelmed, or the spouse wants to, in their mind, protect their significant other that birthed the child. So they're trying to, like, okay, let me just take care of everything, but then it might things might slip because it is a lot to deal with. And again, especially if you have more than one child in the home, which we have seen in these cases, the ones that are publicly available in the media, we do see that there have been cases with multiple children. And so again, that just sort of tenfolds the risk.
Are there any other myths that you can think of that should be busted when it comes to why people would engage in this behavior?
I would just say the biggest one is what we just talked about, that um, they mental illness, it's the equation, it's media and the public might have this equation of causation, right? They're thinking just because you have mental illness doesn't give you the right to kill your kid, or mental illness doesn't mean you kill, which is right. It's not a direct line. There are correlations to severe mental illness and killing a child in filicide, but there's a lot of other factors that are on that pathway to get there. So I would just say the biggest thing is to not say why someone did this, but really trying to understand sort of the pathway of how they got there, the warning signs and the missed interventions possibly, and then, let the forensic psychologist come in and evaluate that mental state, so they can determine whether or not this is a genuine case of psychosis, or mania with psychosis that caused the impairment in the reasoning and the thinking and the understanding of wrongfulness. Because we know mental illness doesn't mean, that you're going to kill. a child. It doesn't mean it's going to lead there. Like we see in some of the other cases, like the Chris Watts case, the man that killed his wife and children. Um, it could be for psychosocial reasons. It could be there's intertwined domestic violence and family issues. It's not always mental illness.
All right, we're wrapping up now, Dr. Vienna. So, if you could, where can people find you? I mean, I have your IG handle up here right now for people to see, but how can people find you?
Pretty much on Instagram. I'm on at Dr. Nicole Vienna. I have my group practice, which we actually don't have too many posts right now. We're revamping our social media. So you can find me at Vienna Psychological Group. I'm on LinkedIn, and I believe my website, vpg-corp.com.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vienna.
Thank you.
All right.